It's extremely difficult for me to get any of my discoveries about my past life as Matthew Franklin Whittier into the mainstream, into the official record, to change the official record. Of course, I've been trying for years now, but I finally made a little tiny bit of progress, and it's significant because it shows that I can do it, and it's a little tiny crack in the wall, see? So I wanted to present that and a little bit of evidence that kind of goes along with it. Now, this has to do with a book that Mathew published in 1855 anonymously. It's The Rag Picker, or Bound and Free. This is a novel very much like Uncle Tom's Cabin, along the same line. The first part of it has to do with the social problems of alcoholism and child abuse and things of that nature, poverty. And the second half is an anti-slavery novel. It includes the Underground Railroad and everything else. William Lloyd Garrison lavishly praised it in his newspaper, The Liberator, about a week after it came out. And then 2 months after it came out, because it was anonymous, 2 months after it came out, George Burnham, Mathew's old plagiarist, along with Francis Durivage, whom I've talked about many times, bought himself a company in Boston. He bought Fetterhen and Company and renamed it Burnham, Fetterhen and Company, near as I can tell. And he started selling this book with his name attached to it. And then he managed to get one or two newspapers, the Boston Herald and the True Flag, if I remember correctly, to get on board with it and proclaim him as the author, see? Well, it didn't work. That's the last we see of it. This book was published in New York City. And if we look at the title page, you'll see, I'm going to put up on the screen, you'll see that there's no author. And where it's registered by the publisher, Mason Brothers, and the printer. There's no indication of any author. And then in the preface, he signs the author from Boston, and Mathew was also living in Boston, 1855. And the dedication, which I won't put up on the screen now, I've done that other times, that's very suspiciously obvious that it's dedicated to Mathew's sister, Elizabeth Whittier. There's no indication that Charles Burnham's sister was the type of person who this dedication would be made to. And then there's a million style indications in the book and personal indications in the book that it's Mathew Franklin Whittier's. So what I did was I wrote a paper, a short paper, and submitted it to Academia EDU. Now, Academia EDU is not really an academic institution. They've instituted a new program whereby they, quote unquote, publish what they call academic letters, little short 1,600-word papers, as though they were a real journal. And they kind of are and they kind of aren't. And those, they send them around to a few of the members, which is the peer review process for them. And, that my little paper on the Rag Picker, which is called The True Authorship of the Rag Picker, or Bound and Free, did get through their review system and was published on Academia EDU. It was viewed by 2,127 people. I guess that means from outside the system or within. It had 148 readers, which I believe means people in their system, paid members, if I'm not correctly. How many of these people read the whole paper is, there are stats, but I don't have them in front of me. So it's like a 4-page paper. Some people might not indicate that they read any. And a lot of these people, like half of them, were from outside the field. So I guess they get an email, and the email has a title that's intriguing to them, and they click on it and they look at it for 3 seconds and say, no, I'm a chemist. This has to do with abolition. And they click out. There's no way of knowing. But 2,127 people saw it. We'll say that. Anyway, so I got this paper published, quote unquote. And then I started writing to people and trying to find who is it that decides what the authorship is. Because this book, apparently a librarian got hold of this book and looked up the name of the book, and she found in an obscure bibliography, which copied over from an even more obscure autobiographical sketch, from the late 1800s, George Burnham's name associated with this. Somebody had found George Burnham's claim to this thing, see, and they had assumed it was true, and they were just pleased as punch to have found this, and they put it in the little biography of George Burnham, and then that got picked up by a bibliography around 1956 or something like that. And then the librarian found that, the acquisitions librarian, and she penciled in George Burnham and the title page. And then that got digitized, and that got sent all over the place. And everybody says, oh, officially, George Burnham is the author. Well, George Burnham was just Mathew Franklin Whittier's plagiarist that had an axe to grind. You know, he had a beef against Mathew. Long story about that. He never wrote that book. He was a racist, for one thing. I know he was a racist because I've gone over this before, but briefly, when Mathew was 18, he represented social stereotypes and ethnic stereotypes much more than he did when he was older. So he wrote in all kinds of dialects, including Irish and French and Yankees and sailors, but he also wrote blacks and black dialect. And it was kind of benign humor. You know, it wasn't vicious. It wasn't hateful, but he poked mild-mannered fun at all of these different ethnic groups. And because he maybe didn't know that many blacks or he didn't know that many Indians, you know, whatever, he would rely on the stereotypes. Later, he learned not to do that. But his early stuff, although it's not really mean, it is racist in the sense today, by today's standards, you would say that this work was racist because it portrays the stereotypes. Well, he was long outgrown from that habit by the time this book was published in 1855, and he was long outgrown from that habit in 1848 when George Burnham, along with Francis Durivage, stole his work. Apparently got him to sign a bogus contract and published a huge portfolio of Mathew's unpublished work. Well, I know that that portfolio went back to 1830 because some of this stuff is early. Some of it includes these little racist sketches, you know, with blacks portrayed in the stereotypical manner for the time. See, he would never have published that on his own or permitted anybody else to publish that in 1848 when that portfolio was stolen. This is going to sound like I'm making excuses for Mathew, but this is the truth, I feel, is that mainly what he was writing a sketch about was people who are braggarts, see? And it so happened the guy was black. So, you know, it wasn't primarily making fun of a black person so much as it was making fun of somebody who bragged, who thought he could do everything, who had a big ego. But the fact that he didn't publish it, that he never published this piece, which is, you know, pretty well written, tells me that he felt it was not wise to publish. He wrote it, the incident that he based it on amused him, but he decided it was probably better not to publish it, and he never would have published it. It was George Burnham, who was an actual racist, who published it in 1848, and in his mind, it was funny because it was a black man, not because he was a braggart. See, so here's the second paragraph. It chances that in the same village where the doctor, quote, holds out, there lives also a stout, brawny representative of the African race. Mathew didn't use the N-word unless he put it in the mouth of a character that he was caricaturing, but otherwise he would call them a son of Africa, or here he says a brawny representative of the African race, who has made himself notorious the country round for his bragging propensities. And as he is the only colored gentleman in the vicinity, he prides himself upon being able to do anything and everything which anybody else can perform. So that's the premise as far as Mathew's concerned. But if you look at the illustration, you see that the illustration really doesn't emphasize that he's big or brawny, you know, or a braggart. It's just a black man, see, and drawn in a very unfavorable light. So this is what I'm trying to say, that George Burnham, the racist, who couldn't possibly have written The Ragpicker, has stolen Mathew Franklin Whittier's work from when he was a young man back in like 1830 or something, when he was not as careful about his portrayals of ethnic stereotypes as he was later on. And when Mathew was basically trying to make a moral tale about bragging, and it happened to be a black man, Burnham thinks it's funny because he's a black man, see? Well, a racist did not publish this book. I guarantee it's impossible. Okay. So George Burnham was not the author, but now he's the official author. And I didn't mean to go on and on like that, but I have to get the background for this thing. So the case is open and shut. You know, it's like no matter what you think of me, no matter what you think of my claims, no matter whether you think I'm delusional, this is an open and shut case. George Burnham was not the author. And that's what I wanted to establish. If I could get Mathew Franklin Whittier's name associated with it, you know, by my research and my logical presentation, that would be great. But I at least wanted to get George Burnham, the con artist, off of it. So finally, I wrote to WorldCat. Now, let me tell you what WorldCat is. We've got a couple definitions. Their definition is WorldCat is the world's largest network of library content and services. WorldCat libraries are dedicated to providing access to their resources on the web, where most people start their search for information. And Wikipedia says, WorldCat is a union catalog that itemizes the collections of 15,637 libraries in 107 countries that participate in the OCLC Global Cooperative. It is operated by OCLC Incorporated. The subscribing member libraries collectively maintain WorldCat's database, the world's largest bibliographic database. So then we get to OCLC, and they tell us OCLC is a nonprofit global library organization providing shared technology services, original research, and community programs so that libraries can better fuel learning, research, and innovation. And Wikipedia says OCLC Incorporated, doing business as OCLC, is an American nonprofit cooperative organization, quote, dedicated to the public purposes of furthering access to the world's information and reducing information costs. It was founded in 1967 as the Ohio College Library Center, then became the Online Computer Library Center as it expanded. Now, this is kind of interesting because how does somebody get to be the authoritative figure, you know, the authoritative organization? Somehow they have. They're the last word in, you know, authorship and who is officially attributed to what. So I wrote to them and I sent them the link to my paper, which I told them was peer-reviewed and published through Academia EDU. I was quite honest. I think I even said it's not really an academic institution, understandably, but nonetheless, it went through their review process and it was published. And that paper is extremely compelling. You know, I mean, it's as I said, it's an open and shut case. Well, I didn't hear from them and I didn't hear from them. Finally, I heard from them and they did it. I couldn't believe it. Now, they didn't do what I expected. What I expected was that they would take George Burnham's name off the thing and officially pronounce it anonymous, which is what it was when it came out in 1855. No, they put both authors on. They said variously attributed, something like that. Let me see. I've got it here. I think. No, I don't have it in front of me. Darn it. The things that, you know, I think in my notes, I've got everything in there and I don't, but I'm going to put it up on the screen and you'll see exactly how it is worded in the listing. It says it's variously attributed either to George Burnham and he gets the first slot, or to Mathew Franklin Whittier or Mathew Whittier. And they spelled it with 2 T's, which he spelled it with 1. I don't think I'll mess with that. But the point is that for posterity, if I can't do anything else, Mathew's name is on here as an alternate possible author. So that was huge. Now I've written back to them. Here's what I heard last, because I'm asking, who can I write to? How does this propagate? In other words, now what, you know? So they said most libraries catalog an item and go on to the next book or item they have, and most often never revisit the catalog record again. So I am not aware of any centralized listing. Well, they are the centralized listing as near as I can tell, but nonetheless. Then she says, in no way does changing the bibliographic record affect what is printed in the actual book itself. So print-on-demand booksellers, I'd asked about that, would still have what was on the item when it was published. However, if a library happens to get this item new in their library and they catalog on OCLC, they will get the record as it has been changed. Also, some libraries use OCLC's WorldCat database as their main library catalog, so they already have access to the changed words. Now, I wrote back because I was confused about this. She says, in no way does changing the bibliographic record affect what is printed in the actual book itself. Well, nothing was printed in the actual book itself. George Burnham was not printed, quote unquote, printed in the actual book. It was penciled in by accident. So one would think that that's fair game. See, that should change what the booksellers are printing, if that's what they mean. So print-on-demand booksellers would still have what was on the item when it was published. Well, yeah, George Burnham's name was on the item, penciled in mistakenly. See, they'll have it all right. I could give them a picture of my copy where I've erased it. So I'm going to be going after the booksellers as well. Looks like it's up to me. So I'm going to have to start writing people. Now, again, this is significant because it means that I actually got the official record changed, and I may be able to get it changed all the way across the board. If I can get to the point that the print-on-demand people take George Burnham's name off of there, I will have accomplished what I set out to do. But this is pretty significant. Now, as I said, there's a million examples of Mathew in this book. I mean, there's a huge section that's basically autobiographical, where it's like he's expunging his guilt, about his own behavior, basically, in a huge part of this book. So, and there's expressions and everything. Now, I wanted to show you something else. That's 1855. This is 1856. This is a little booklet. It's anonymous. It's titled "A Plain Statement Addressed to All Honest Democrats by One of the People." It's published in Boston in 1856. And I knew this thing as soon as I set eyes on it, either through past life memory or long familiarity with Mathew Franklin Whittier's writing style. I can't say for sure. I didn't have a memory like I remembered sitting down and writing it, but I know this is Mathew Franklin Whittier's work, I'm telling you. Well, there are a couple indicators, and this is not to prove to anybody, but there are a couple indicators, and one of them is this chivalrous, quote unquote, Kentuckian, this is a speech in Kentucky he's just quoted, seems to have no higher estimate of the intelligence of the great body of working men, or what he calls, quote, white Negroes, than to suppose that they must, quote, go it blind and vote just as their, quote, employers tell them to do. Well, I recognize that phrase, go it blind, okay? That's one of Mathew's favorite little colloquialisms. I've demonstrated how I can tally up Mathew's favorite colloquialisms and show exactly in a spreadsheet exactly what publications at what dates he used these various colloquialisms. So I ran go it and go it blind through my database. First off, for go it, there's a total of 25. There's 6 instances of go it as a colloquialism, which show up in the stolen works from Duravage and Burnham's works that they stole from Mathew. There's one in the New England Galaxy. We're talking 1825 to 1830, roughly. One in the New York Constellation. That's 1830 to 1832. 2 in the New York Transcript. That's around 1835. There's 4 in the Portland Transcript, which runs from like 1838 all the way to the end of Mathew's writing career in 1873 or 75. There's 4 in the Boston Chronotype. That's the radical newspaper that Mathew contributed to. It ran from about 1846 to 1850. The Weekly Museum has 3. That's where Mathew was writing as Quails, which historians think was entertainer Ocean Dodge. It was not. It was Mathew. There's 3 in the Carpetbag. That's the humorous magazine that Mathew was financially invested in and contributed to very heavily under a bunch of different pseudonyms. That ran from 1851 to 1853. Then there's one in a little paper called the Cayuga Chief. That's one of 2 versions of a story Mathew wrote about his courtship with Abby, how he went to a dance and, and so on, made a fool of himself. So it shows up in 25 instances, but go it blind, there's 2 instances of go it blind exactly like what is given here in this plain statement. And I don't think go it blind was that common, see? I mean, I'm sure it was known and there were some people that used it, but, it's not that common. So I'm going to show you those. They both appear in the Carpetbag. One of them is in my volume 1 that I have. This is the first volume, 1851-52 of the Carpetbag. And I'm going to read that for you and put it up on the screen. So this here is an unsigned piece concerning Ensign Stebbings. Actually, it's not unsigned. It's written by Ensign Stebbings. Jehiel Stebbings was a character who was very popular in the Carpetbag. He was supposedly running for president. He was a fictional character. He was a caricature of the military mentality, an ultra-military man, see? And he supposedly ran for president the way that Pat Paulson ran for president, and it became very popular. And the editor, Benjamin Penhallow Shillaber, in his memoirs many years later, attributed this whole series, which started out with the pseudonym Trismegistus. He attributed all that to Benjamin Drew, who was a career teacher and principal and a part-time contributor to the Boston Post. But I got into Benjamin Drew's papers, and it wasn't Benjamin Drew. It was Mathew Franklin Whittier. Mathew Franklin Whittier used that pseudonym Trismegistus as early as 1828, like 4 times, and then a couple times again in 1835 in the New York transcript. So this was all Mathew, this guy running for president. It was Mathew's satire on the military, because Mathew was anti-military, having been raised Quaker, see? So anyway, underneath this letter from Jehiel Stebbings, we have opinions of the press, okay? So what Mathew has done, writing as Jehiel Stebbings, is to give excerpts of reviews about Stebbings' candidacy from all these different newspapers. Some are real newspapers. One of them is the Spunkville Patriot. Well, Jehiel Stebbings supposedly hails from Spunkville, see, typical name for Mathew to create. And, of course, that's not a real paper. But then we have the Boston Courier, which is a real paper, and the Chelsea Telegraph. Apparently, this was the Libertarian paper, which back then was called the Loco Foco Party. So he says, our readers know that we are, and always have been, opposed to coalitions. But the character of Ensign Stebbings and his prospects of success warp us materially from our professed principles. So we say to our readers, sub rosa, that we shall tap the Carpetbag's whiskey barrel, says parentheses, see our last number, and go it blind for Stebbings. So there he's using go it blind. And then again in the same paper, and this is not something I have a physical edition of, but it is in the November 6th, 1852 edition, and it's written by Ethan Spike, which is Mathew's one known character. Mathew is acknowledged by historians to have written Ethan Spike, so this is definitely him. And they have resolutions. So Ethan Spike would go to meetings and there'd be resolutions, and this is the 6th one. Resolved that it is the sense of this meeting to go it blind. He says, now, henceforth and forevermore, Selah, for Ensign Jehiel Stebbings of Spunkville for president of these sovereign states. Amen. So Ethan Spike, Mathew's character, is endorsing his own character, Ensign Jehiel Stebbings of Spunkville, and he uses the phrase go it blind. We know now there was a bunch of the authors that contributed to a Carpetbag that jumped on the bandwagon and wrote about Ensign Stebbings, but we know this is Mathew because he spells Ensign I-N-S-I-N-E, which doubles for insane. None of the other ones would do that because none of the other ones were sarcastic enough about the military to call Ensign Stebbings insane. See, the other ones actually were not anti-military and they were trying to tone it down. Mathew was lampooning the guy, see? So only Mathew called him Ensign, I-N-S-I-N-E, which could be read as insane, Jehiel Stebbings. So there Mathew uses go it blind a second time. So there's other clues, but this is Mathew Franklin Whittier's work in 1856, Anti-Slavery Booklet to Conservatives. This is Mathew's anti-slavery novel, Anonymous, in 1855. So I broke in. Now, I asked the person I wrote to at WorldCat, I wrote her some pretty pointed questions, and I pointed out to her that this book was anonymous. It was published anonymous. Now, it's possible I've shot myself in the foot, and she'll look at it and say, oh, I didn't know it was published anonymously. We need to take both names off. I hope she doesn't, because I've got Matthew Franklin Whittier's name somehow or other. I've got it in there in the listing now. See, so, it's a little tiny thing. It's a little foothold. So, you see these guys climb up a cliff, free climbing, and they grab any little tiny toehold, well, this is a toehold. But here's the thing, one toehold after another, and you get to the top of the mountain. At some point, I may be able to change the official attribution for A Christmas Carol or for The Raven, see, or for the poetry by Elizabeth Barrett Browning. Now whether I can do this in my lifetime or not, I don't know. But anyway, I'm sorry this is so long. We've almost half an hour. It really could have been like 5 minutes. But I like to give a little bit of depth and a little bit of background in these things, because this is a start. See, I can actually do this. I would love to have some help. I need funding. I need people to recommend me, for talks and for interviews and so on. Now, I do have a couple of things coming up. And one of the things I have coming up possibly is to present virtually, on Zoom or whatever, to the Theosophical Society. So we'll see. I've got a couple proposed talks into them. I think I've got a pretty good shot at least presenting one of them. And then I've got like 4 papers that are currently submitted to, real academic scholarly journals. And I've got another proposal for a presentation to another a mainstream organization, as opposed to a esoteric or paranormal organization. One of the 4 papers is submitted to a what you call an esoteric journal, an established one. So, I'm just trying to see, can I get into the mainstream? Can I break in anywhere? And I think if I'm persistent, eventually I think I can. A friend of mine recently just told me that he became convinced that I'm not crazy and not a hoaxer because of the amount of effort that I put into this, And what I told him was, when you're climbing a mountain and you get to the top, you look down and you say, gosh, I can't believe that I climbed so far. You don't realize it at the time. Well, 12 years, every day, all my energies that I didn't need for anything else, like survival, have been going into this. Every day I work on this, and that's been 12 years. So of course, I've got a lot to show for it. I've got a huge database. I've got a huge legacy. Mathew's legacy and Abby Poyen Whittier's legacy is now organized and put together, and a lot of it is physical. This is extremely rare, by the way. You can't find a copy of this anywhere for sale, the original. So I've got a lot of rare originals, and now it's just a matter of how am I going to preserve this stuff. But if I can get this into the mainstream, I'm pretty sure I will be able to preserve it, at least donating as a collection to a larger institution. If I donate it as a collection now, without having gotten into the mainstream and established that this is real, it'll just get split up. At some point, they'll be low on funds, and we'll say, well, we can split up this Sakellarios collection. It's a bunch of nonsense. Let's sell off these things that are rare. George Burnham's book, let's sell that off. And let's sell off the copies of The Raven. That's pretty, we'll get a little money off of those. And, nobody believes that Mathew Franklin Whittier wrote that anyway. See, so that's what would happen if I donated the collection before I get the authenticity of my work established publicly. Not at first, but sooner or later. They'd be a little bit tight for funds, and somebody would say, we need the space, whatever. And they say, let's sell these off. But afterwards, it's going to be a different story. So let's see.